Hello, everybody. Good evening. Welcome.
It's so great to see you and see so many people here. It's terrific, but you have to understand this is nothing compared to the number of people who are online. So apparently there's something very interesting about either Boston or Dan. So for those of you who haven't met yet, I'm Catherine Auger. I'm the president here of this esteemed institution, and I'm delighted to have you here for A History of Boston with Daniel Dain. And what a terrific day this is for us to host this event, because today is the MHS's 233rd birthday. The good news I have for you is we're not singing. That's really the good news. Well, the really great news is I'm not singing. But it was on this day, January 24th, 1791, that Jeremy Belknap and a handful of like-minded Bostonians joined together to form a repository and a publisher that would collect, preserve, and disseminate resources for the study of American history. And I'm here to say that after 233 years, the MHS continues to do this vital work. And we're able to do that because of support of friends like you, because of your continued generosity. We're able to provide access to our ever-growing body of digital editions, fund our fellowships for our researchers, support our K-12 students with resources, and of course take all those fabulous, wonderful students through History Day. And of course, thought-provoking programs such as tonight. I like Daniel Dain's can-do attitude. He took on the enormous task of writing a comprehensive history of Boston, well, because he understands the importance of history, something very near and dear to our hearts. He's the co-founder of Dain, Torpy, LeGray, Viest, and Garner, PC, a boutique law firm for the commercial real estate industry in Massachusetts. In a Globe piece that he wrote this past summer, he says that he regularly speaks with clients about ongoing changes and investing in the city. To better answer these questions, Daniel knew he had to understand the history of Boston, its sort of cyclical history of triumph and stagnation. So he set out to read every book he could find on Boston history, which I think was like 300, yes? But this is the take charge guy. He then wrote his own. You know, I would have given up after book 5. It's a wonderful book. It'll be available for sale afterwards. I have to tell you, Daniel, that I got the book and I looked at it, and instead of doing the responsible thing, like look at the many wonderful blurbs in the back, right, or read the great acknowledgments and introduction, I just went to the index and looked up the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I have to say, I was gratified, as we would say in the 18th century, to see us there. But I also have to say on a serious note that when I was looking through the book, you are so very generous and transparent about the role that libraries and archives played in your work. It's in your book, and I'm very grateful. So I'll speak for all the librarians here and online. Thank you. So thank you for this wonderful program. Thank you to our audience, both in person and virtual. And then we'll sell books afterwards. So I'm going to present, with no further ado, our author for tonight, Daniel Dain.
Thank you for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here for the Massachusetts Historical Society. So my book covers 580 million years of history of this region. So I thought what we do tonight is I would just probably use it if I just march year by year through it. I hope people have a couple of days to be here. I'll just consecutively So I do cover 580 million years because I thought understanding the geologic and geographic history of the region was important to understanding the history of the city. But let me start by saying a few words about what motivated me to do this project, what my conclusions were, and then we'll just sort of jump into Boston history and see how they sort of support what my conclusions are, up and down. But my day job is as a trial lawyer, and what that means is that I'm used to being in front of hot benches with judges that interrupt me when I'm giving talks, and so I'm used to questions while I'm talking. And so if I say anything that I have no doubt there are people in this audience who know Boston history way better than I do. So if you disagree with something I say or you want to know more, just jump up and say something or raise your hand, because that makes this more interesting to me. So in my law practice, I represent real estate developers, and my real estate developer clients, they come to us and they say, we want to build a new building in Boston, and it's a multi-year investment that they're making in the city. And so this notion of we're going to build a new residential building or an office building in the city that's going to take 3, 4, 7 years to come to fruition, these developer clients of ours, are essentially making a prediction as to the future, which is we're in this period today that I call high urbanism. And I define high urbanism as a period of time when people want to live, work, play, study, shop, visit in a city, in our case, Boston. And so this prediction of the future is that after this period of time, it'll still be the case that by the time you open your apartment building, there'll be people who want to live in Boston, or an office building, there'll be tenants who want to rent in the building. And so it struck me as someone who grew up in Boston. I grew up in Boston in the 1970s and 1980s. And I remember that the Boston that I grew up in, the best term that I could use to describe that Boston was a basket case. So what interested me was how is it that Boston has been so successful really over the last 30 years, and yet I'm old enough to remember that was not the case all that long ago. And so I looked further back to the 19th century to try to understand what was going on in the 19th century. And Boston was so successful in the 19th century that there were so many people who wanted to live and work in Boston in the 19th century that one of the things that, this is participatory, so I may call on people, but what did we do as a city in the 19th century to accommodate all the people who wanted to be in Boston? Landfill, right? So, the Back Bay is the one that we think of the most, but it's not just the Back Bay. It starts with the filling in of the waterfront. We knocked down the Tri-Mountains, Mount Vernon, Beacon Hill, and Pemberton Hill to fill in the waterfront. South End and South Cove, Back Bay. East Boston was a series of islands that were filled in. South Boston was a small peninsula off of Dorchester. That's landfill. So we greatly expanded the land. And what else did we do to accommodate all the people that wanted to be here? Annexation, right? The annexation movement in Boston in the 19th century. So you have this period of great success over the last 30 years. And to appreciate the success of the city, Boston today is really number one in the world in hospitals, in universities, sports teams, venture capital, investment in life science companies. As of a few years ago, it was actually third in most venture capital invested in the city, more than New York City. Cranes are around the city. Our population of Boston is higher than it's been in 50 years or so. So a period of great success. And about the failures of the 20th century, which I'll get into in a little bit more detail. In 1920, there's a deep deflationary recession, a national deflationary recession. And so the returning GIs, World War I had largely been financed through printing money. So World War I ends, returning GIs, great deflation. And what do people do when there's deflation? If you're thinking about buying something and it's going to be cheaper if you wait a couple months, you don't spend money today. You wait and you hope that it'll be less expensive in the future. And so there was this deep deflationary recession in 1920. Deep deflationary recession in 1920. And so the industry of New England reacts to this recession, the deep deflationary recession, by looking for lower labor costs. and start relocating to the American South and to overseas. And so we lose our industrial base in the 1920s, and the city goes into really a 70-year period of decline and stagnation across the 20th century. So just a few things about the decline of the 20th century, which is really just hard to imagine today given the success of the city, but just a few things. So 1915, the Custom House Tower opens, 496 feet. Anyone know what year and what building was the next time Boston built something taller than the Custom House Tower? 1964, right? So 49 years later. 49 years, we did not build something taller than the Custom House Tower. You know, when you see pictures of the Prudential Center when it opens, it's completely by itself. You know, it's like, you know, 6-story buildings and then the Prudential Tower. 1950s, Moody's rates Boston's bond rating at just above the junk bond level. 1950s, right? Population of Boston in 1950, does anyone know what the population was? 801,000, yep, very close. 1980, what's the population of Boston in 1980? 570, yeah. So Boston loses 230,000 people in 30 years. 1982, the Brookings Institute declares Boston the most blighted big city in the country, right? We sort of look down today on Pittsburgh and Buffalo and Cleveland and Detroit. Well, in 1982, Boston was considered more blighted than even those cities. Ed Glazer, the great Harvard economist, has studied property values in Boston. In the 1980s, 3/4 of all homes in Boston were worth less. Their market value was worth less than the cost of construction. So if you built a new home in Boston in the 1980s, the day you put it on the market, your price was going to be lower than you just spent to build it, which makes sense, right? If 230,000 people are moving out of the city in 30 years, you're not going to build new housing in the 1980s, right? So great success over the last 30 years, great failure in Boston for 70 years, and then great success in the 19th century we talked about. So many people wanted to live and work in Boston, we had to fill in the water and annex neighboring towns, right? So this is what motivated the book project. I wanted to understand this. In order to advise my clients, what are we doing right today? What did we do so wrong for 70 years? And what did we do right in the 19th century? What are those lessons that we took from that? So I just started starting in December of 2017. My wife, who's in the back, Julie, had to put up with me. I just started reading books, and I took it as a challenge that every book that I would pick up to read, I would read cover to cover, and I tried to read one book a week. I actually exceeded that. I read 265 books in 4 years, articles, everything I get my hands on about the city. My poor family for 4 years got dragged around to every historic home and museum and the like in greater Boston and New England to try to understand this history. And so the conclusion I drew in the book is that city building, successful cities, are based on what I call the 3 Ds. And those 3 Ds are density, diversity, and good urban design. So stepping back, success of cities is based on creating spaces, design, architecture, that people want to be in, right? That people enjoy, the nice surroundings. Like this is a beautiful building, a beautiful space. We bring people together. Density, lots of people, and then the people that you bring together have to have diversity, have to have different experiences, different background, different perspectives. Diversity, we're talking about ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, age diversity, different experiences. And what social science teaches us, as well as history, is that successful outcomes, innovation, good decision-making is based on people from different backgrounds and different experiences coming together and exchanging ideas. So cities get their vitality from constant innovation, and innovation requires lots of people to come together from different backgrounds and different experiences exchange ideas, and the outcomes are improved. Okay, so that's the thesis. Now, I acknowledge also that when you're writing a book or something like that, you put things in neat packages, and I have this story of 19th century failure, 19th century success, 20th century failure, success today. We'll get to some challenges today. Obviously, none of this is exactly linear. There's exceptions and everything, but I wanted to test this theory or hypothesis through studying the history of the city. And so, while my book is the sort of parameters of the book is a study in urbanism and what makes cities successful, I wanted to just understand the history of the city, the whole city, and so lots of it are tied to trying to back up my theory or hypothesis, and lots of it is just because it's interesting. And just about me as a trial attorney, what my one skill is not so much as a historian, but someone who tells stories, right? As an advocate for my clients, my job is to take a set of facts that generally someone else gives me and put it organize it in a way that tells an interesting story. So I think the book is a collection of interesting stories. It's 800 pages, so there are a lot of them, but essentially a series of short stories about the history of Boston that then try to have this unifying theme and try to answer questions. So let's dig in. I won't go back 580 million years ago, but history of Boston, going back to the first settlers, there's evidence of first peoples in New England about 9,000 to 12,000 years ago. The Archaic period is about 4,000 to 2,700 years ago, which is where you get like the fish wares that are found in the Back Bay. And then more recently, the Algonquian the language group, so series of tribes throughout New England have a common language with dialects, but the Algonquian language, the Algonquians are not a tribe of New England, it's a family of languages. So we have the Massachusetts who settle in the vicinity of Boston, sort of eastern Massachusetts, the central part. You have the Wampanoags in southeastern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the Nauset in Cape Cod, Nipmucks and others in the region. And so, what interested me about studying the Native Americans of the area is that the Native Americans really arguably are the first urbanists. They lived communally in villages. They cultivated the land. The notion of the New World being a wild place, Europeans actually knew that was not the case from explorers. So that Native Americans had very sophisticated agriculture, obviously hunting as well. European explorers start coming to the region. John Smith explores 1614 to 1616. He draws up a map where he names Plymouth and Charlestown and Charles River. So some of these in New England, some of these names that we know today go back to 1614 to 1616 with John Smith. But these explorers coming to the area do something extremely upsetting to the Native Americans, which is kidnap Native Americans to take them back to Europe. And this makes the Native Americans displeased, and so the Native Americans essentially come up with a policy in the mid-1610s of forcibly opposing European explorers. So in 1616, French explorers come to Cape Cod and their ship flounders on the rocks. They're attacked by the Nauset. All but 5 are killed of the French explorers. These 5 explorers who are essentially taken hostage by the Nauset apparently have a disease. It's unclear what the disease is. Variously believed to be hepatitis or yellow fever or smallpox, but it triggers an immensely deep pandemic across the native population. And between 1616 and 1619, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the Native Americans on the coast of Massachusetts die. So the Massachusetts are nearly wiped out. In 1619, an English explorer named Thomas Dermer, exploring the coast of Massachusetts, comes by Patuxet. He has a kidnapped Native American named Tisquantum, or Squanto, who plays a big role a few years later in the history of southeastern Massachusetts. But Tisquantum's home village was Patuxet. Thomas Dermer's diary from the trip, he said his notation about Patuxet is all dead. The next year, 1620, a group of, they're called at the time separatists, come and settle in Patuxet or Plymouth, according to John Smith's map. The separatists are part of a larger movement of what are called the Puritans in England. The separatists and the Puritans both believe that, and there's a lot in my book about it, so just very briefly about Puritanism, that essentially a rebellion against what they saw as the excesses of the Church of England gets its sort of intellectual basis from Calvinism on the continent, and the Puritans try to purify the Church of England. The separatists are so dogmatic that rather than purify the church, they want to separate entirely from the Church of England. Both the separatists and the greater body of Puritans face great persecution in England. The separatists move to Leiden to avoid the persecution. They start having children who start being raised as Dutch, but they can continue to consider themselves English and make the decision to relocate to the New World. We know them today as the Pilgrims, which was not a term that was used contemporaneously, although the word is used in the writing of William Bradford, not because he named them Pilgrims, but does describe what they were undergoing as a pilgrimage. The great body of Puritans, the Great Puritan Migration, starts in 1630. 17 ships come over in 1630 of bringing Puritans. Anyone know what the first ship is called? The Arbella, bringing the leadership of the Puritans, including John Winthrop. Interestingly, both the separatists as well as the Puritan migration are organized as corporate structures. It's not originally called Massachusetts Bay Colony, it's called the Massachusetts Bay Company. It is a for-profit investment. There are investors in England. Both the Pilgrims and the Puritans are coming over for the purpose of making money through fishing and trade for pelts, furs, to send back to England. They're not very good at that. They did not have very many skills. These were craftspeople from villages of England. But John Winthrop lands, and anyone know where the Arbella lands in? Salem, yeah. John Winthrop and the Arbella come to Salem. There's already an established Puritan settlement in Salem at the time. But Winthrop does not like Salem and goes off in search of a more appropriate place for a permanent Puritan settlement. And he winds up in Charles. Wow, this is a really, really good crowd. I'm super impressed. At any point, just come up and join me here. So they set up tents in Charlestown in 1630, and they're visited by a very strange hermit who'd been living across the Charles River on a house by himself. He's a reverend, and his name is William Blackstone, who later changed his name to Blackstone. He'd come over in 1624 in an earlier expedition that had failed and had left, but he made his way north and settled on the Shawmut Peninsula, again, largely devoid of the native population due to the disease, the Great Dying from 1616 to 1619. Puritans become the second group of urbanists in the area. They live in villages. They do not adopt the plantation model that you see in Virginia. And there's generally three reasons given for why the Puritans settled in towns. Since you guys are so good, what are the three? Self-defense, yep. It could be, yeah. Very important to the Puritans. You had to do something every single week. Church, yeah, right. So mandatory church attendance, so you had to be close enough. And schools as well. The Puritans believed that people had to create their own relationship with God, which meant that people needed to be literate to read the scriptures. And so school was mandatory. And the third reason is the Puritans wanted to keep their eye on people from misbehaving, right? So Puritans settle in villages. As the Great Puritan Migration continues, Dorchester, Roxbury get settled as separate towns, Cambridge, Watertown, actually Cambridge is called Newtown at the time. So I'm not going to go year by year, but you get the point. This is when Boston becomes settled. Let me jump into the economy because it's going to tie into our great themes. So throughout the colonial period and up to the early federal period. So now I'm talking. So the very earliest economy of Boston and of Plymouth is subsistence. They had to just feed themselves, right? Even though this was meant to be a profitable endeavor for the investors back in England, originally they're just trying to survive. But very quickly, the economy becomes based on three pillars. And I'm talking about the New England economy. And this is the case throughout the colonial period into the federal period and early years of the Republic. So the three pillars of the New England economy are fishing is big, yep. Oh, so rum is very important, but that's part of trade and agriculture. Okay, so the three bases of the economy are agrarian, farming, timber. So fishing would be cod and other fish, but the big one is whaling. Whaling becomes immensely important to the economy of New England. And this sort of raises, I'll just sort of flag a challenge for me in writing the history as well as anyone trying to write a history of Boston, which is, what is Boston? How do you define a city? Which is really interesting. If you ever, I'm very interested in how you define cities in terms of population. If you ever Google, largest cities in the world, every list you get completely disagrees with each other. You never get two lists that are the same because no one can agree on what's the definition of a city boundary, right? So you have the political boundary, which is, clearly demarcated. If you're talking about, what's Boston in terms of housing, it really reaches from Rhode Island into southern New Hampshire. If you're talking about the economy of Boston, you're really talking about all of New England, right? So when we talk about the economy of Boston, it reaches all of New England because all of these different aspects of the economy are financed out of Boston. The capital comes from Boston. Boston's a trade center. So whaling industry based in Nantucket in the colonial period and then really moves to New Bedford. Whaling's largely not done out of Boston, but it's financed out of Boston. And to understand the economy, you have to understand the importance of whaling. So very important. And then trade starts, we are not a resource-rich place, so gold and silver, do we have any gold and silver? We do, actually, very, very small, not enough to be profitable. Not a plantation model, really not an extraction economy, right? So England's not making profit, the investors in England are not making profits in Boston off of extracting wealth from the land. So instead, Boston established itself through trade, and originally what they realized, the merchants in Boston realized, is that the sugar plantations in the West Indies are so incredibly profitable that the plantation owners only want to grow sugarcane in the West Indies, and so they need everything else. And so Boston merchants become the suppliers of food and timber and horses to turn the mills to grind the sugar, as well as other goods. And Boston merchants realize during early what are called the Indian Wars that war kidnapped Native Americans through the wars could be traded to the West Indies to work at the sugar plantations. the Native Americans were difficult slave labor on the plantations, and so Boston merchants got into the trade of kidnapped human beings from the coast of Africa, not just out of Boston, all of New England, particularly out of Rhode Island. So a major part of the economy is, and this is where we get to rum. Ships from New England go to the coast of Africa to trade rum for kidnapped human beings, who are then brought to the West Indies, then traded for molasses brought to New England and distilled into rum. Some of the rum stays in New England, but most of it gets traded. The triangular trade becomes a little bit more complex than this because there's lots of other stops and other goods, but that's sort of the basis of it. The trade in human beings is just a portion of trade. By the 1790s, the China trade opens, and immensely successful. Huge profits in the China trade. Does anyone actually know what we were trading in China? Fur, yeah, from the Pacific Northwest. So the merchant ships from New England were going to the Pacific Northwest, trading with the Native Americans, purchasing furs, pelts, bringing them to Canton, trading in China. But soon markets open in India, Russia, Sweden. Trade becomes immensely important. We have this incredible success throughout the colonial period and into the early years of the New Republic. But something interesting happens in the first half of the 19th century, particularly by the 1840s. All three pillars of the New England economy collapse. They don't go away entirely, but they no longer are sustainable as a basis for economy. So what happens with agriculture as a major part of the economy? Yeah, so the opening of the Ohio River Valley, if you're a farmer in New England, it kind of sucks. It's really hard. So what do you have in New England? You have very rocky soil, and it's really cold. It's just very hard to be a farmer in New England. As I understand it, the land is relatively fertile, but small farming lots, and so it becomes very difficult. And when the Ohio River Valley opens in the early years of the Republic, an enormous migration of farmers to the Midwest, to what was called the Northwest Territories at the time. So it's interesting, like, I forget the numbers, but something like 50% of the population of Vermont leaves Vermont in the first decades of the 19th century. Entire villages just become ghost towns almost overnight. Huge lost population in Maine, western Massachusetts. So the farm economy largely disappears. There's other reasons than just the opening of the Northwest Territories and the Ohio River Valley, so we'll get to in terms of industrialization, but land becomes lucrative, and so farmers are selling their land, as well as the industrial economy rises, there's demand for labor, and so a lot of people growing up who would have been farmers take jobs in the industrial economy. So the agrarian economy collapses. Obviously, we still have farms today. Some are quite successful, but it's no longer a pillar of the economy, right? If someone asked you today, what's the basis of New England economy, you probably wouldn't say agriculture very high on the list. The maritime economy, fishing and whaling. So two major things basically destroy this economy. Thoughts on sort of the two major reasons of the collapse of oil and kerosene, yeah. And the other big one is just overfishing, right? So the whaling ships from this time, New Bedford in the 19th century. So just quickly on whaling, the very first whalers, so to speak, took drift whales, so whales that washed ashore, and then shore whaling, which the early European settlers learned from the Native Americans, which is you stand on the shore, you look out, you see the spout going up, you get in your whaleboats, you row out, but that didn't last too long. There weren't too many whales left on the coast of New England after a few years. The whaleboats then went across the Atlantic. Pretty quickly, whales were fished out of the Atlantic by and large. Whaleboats went out into the Pacific, up to the Arctic. And so the combination of introduction of kerosene and oil and just not very many whales left means that that pillar of the economy collapses. Also, Civil War, the whaling ships are used in the war effort and a loss of a lot of ships. So by the end of the Civil War, there's really no more whaling economy. That industry ends. Trade collapses as, obviously trade continues to today, but no longer a pillar of the economy. And the sort of precipitating event is the opening of the Erie Canal. All these goods from the Midwest are going out the Erie Canal to the Hudson River, down to New York. New York has a deeper harbor, bigger ships, and New York just surpasses Boston, and Boston never catches up and largely gets lapsed. So we have what sounds like a little bit of a depressing story here, which is a complete collapse of the pillars of the economy by the 1840s. And yet, I told you at the beginning of this that 19th century Boston was so successful that it had to fill in land and annex nearby towns because so many people wanted to live and work and, I said urbanism, study in Boston, visit Boston. And so the three pillars of the economy get replaced by an industrial economy, right? So textiles is the start of it. So the Industrial Revolution is thought to have started in England in the late 18th century, but the start of the Industrial Revolution in the United States is traced to Massachusetts in the 1810s, and it starts with an act of industrial espionage by who? Francis Cabot Lowell, yep. So Francis Cabot Lowell makes a small fortune, not a big fortune, but a small fortune in the China trade. And the China trade, though, is incredibly lucrative, but also extremely risky, right? Because the boats that were going to the Pacific Northwest stop in Hawaii, go out to China, often with additional stops in Southeast Asia. These boats were gone for 3 or 4 years. And a funny thing happens when you're in a sailboat for 3 or 4 years. Sometimes there are storms or pirates or privateers or things like that. The risk of loss from the China trade was very high, even though it was very lucrative. And so for these Boston merchant princes that were making great profits, it was also very tiring and very risky. And so after the embargo of 1807, Thomas Jefferson's, which we probably beyond what we want to talk about today, but a lot of the merchants involved in trade are looking for new ways of making money. Francis Cabot Lowell goes to visit the power looms in Lancashire in England, and those owners of the mills, while they could be visited, were petrified of people stealing their trade secrets. So the owners of the mills in England had very strict rules. They could be visited, but there was no note-taking, no drawings, and everyone who visited them were searched. Francis Cabot Lowell was searched 3 times. While he was there, his bags were searched when he left. Francis Cabot Lowell, having spent 2 years visiting these mills, took no notes, made no drawings. Returns to Massachusetts in 1812, starts working with an engineer named Paul Moody, and they have an office on Broad Street in Boston. And they spend a year trying to recreate the power looms that Francis Cabot Lowell had memorized, and they actually improve upon it, and they open mills in Waltham on the Charles River, which are quite successful, but Charles River's water flow is not terribly strong. Francis Cabot Lowell passes away, and his associates Nathan Appleton and Patrick Jackson look for stronger source of current, which they find through the Middlesex Canal system in North Chelmsford, I guess, which then gets renamed as Lowell, and the American Industrial Revolution is kicked off into high gear. So, incredible success, incredible profits, financed through Boston. A lot of these China traders invest their money in the emerging industry and make enormous wealth through investing in industry. Sort of interesting to think about the Industrial Revolution and what was being changed. So early changes through the Industrial Revolution were basically improvements in the way products were being manufactured, right? So making it more cheaply, less reliant on expensive craft labor, more reliant on low-cost labor. So improvements in the system of manufacture. The end products were ones that already existed, right? So textile industry, we had textiles before. As the Industrial Revolution goes on, there's a change, and the innovation that happens starts becoming innovation not just in the manufacturing process, but in the manufacture or the invention of entirely new products that never existed before, products that no one thought, like, we need a telephone, but Alexander Graham Bell invents a telephone in 1875 in Boston. So all these new products start emerging out of Boston. Incredible success. Until 1920, when, as we learned, the economy collapses. The industrial economy in New England collapses, and I wouldn't have talked about how stagnant the economy of New England was throughout the 20th century if there had been a great success story when the industrial economy collapsed. The answer is that it was not a success story. Unlike the 19th century, when the pillars of the economy collapsed and we replaced it with a new economy, we don't do so in New England from the 1920s to the 1990s till the rise of the knowledge-based economy. So this leads to the sort of big question in my book, which is, why is Boston successful in reinventing its economy in the first half of the 19th century? It fails to do so for 70 years in the 20th century, and then does so, reinvents its economy finally by the 1990s into a knowledge-based economy, and then what are the lessons for today? So what's going on in New England during these periods that coincide with the ability to reinvent an economy or not successfully reinvent the economy? So what are the failures in the 20th century? It goes back to my 3Ds. Let's examine some of the practices and policies. We have federal, state, and local policies adopted in New England, not just in New England, nationwide as well, that conspire against the success of cities. So highly anti-urban federal, state, and local policies throughout most of the 20th century. So let's talk about some of them. A few things that we should mention. 1924, the Immigration Act. So Boston had been revitalized and kept invigorated through immigration throughout the 19th century, with German and Irish immigration in the 1840s, and Eastern European Jewish immigration and Italians from southern Italy, Greece, and other places throughout the second half of the 19th century up into the 1920s. And then you get an anti-immigration movement. The national anti-immigration movement is based where? In Boston. So Boston, this great place of innovation, rallies the country to the anti-immigration movement. The leader of the movement on a national level is Senator Lodge, who for years tries to get immigration reform passed. There's also the Immigration Restriction League founded in Boston by 3 Harvard alums, the intellectual basis for the anti-immigration movement is written about and comes out of Boston and leads eventually to the adoption of the National Immigration Act, 1924, which effectively closes the borders. The law is more complicated than that. It's based on a quota system through a compromise looking back 30 years, I think, to 1890, before immigrants were coming in very large numbers from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, but it was based on a quota system of a certain percentage of the people who lived in the country as of that date, effectively closing the borders. So we're no longer invigorated with new people coming into Boston. Reformers also looked at the city. Boston had become densely crowded, a lot of immigrants living on the waterfront, and they saw some real failures in the city, the social reformers. It was very crowded. It was, the waterfront of Boston in particular was thought to be unhealthy. Fire was a scourge, crime. So the social reformers looked to a movement coming out of Europe known as the Garden City movement, which was the notion of separating industry from where people live, as well as creating separation between buildings. And in 1924, Boston adopts its first zoning act, or the state does for Boston. And so it separates industry and requires separation between buildings. All for good social reform reasons, the idea being that if you separate buildings and you separate industry, you remove pollution from where people live. If buildings are separated, it helps prevent fires, it helps prevent crime, it helps prevent the spread of disease. But we basically outlawed the neighborhoods of Boston that were most vital, the most dense. So if people came up with a list of their favorite neighborhoods today, all of which predate the Zoning Act of 1924, all of them suddenly became unlawful with the adoption of the Zoning Act. North End, Beacon Hill, Back Bay, South End, Charlestown, you couldn't build any of them once zoning was adopted. Some other, just quickly look at my notes. After zoning, another thing I'll mention is censorship. So people have heard the term banned in Boston and the Watch and Ward Society. This was a real thing. Interestingly, it started by Protestant Yankee reformers using it as a way of attacking what they saw as high levels of drunkenness and other vices in the Irish Catholic community. But it gets the Catholic Church in Boston embraces the sort of censorship movement. Originally, the censorship movement is meant to eliminate what was considered obscene material, but it quickly morphs from an attack on obscenity to attack on any orthodox or unorthodox or radical ideas. So plays, books, magazines are heavily censored. Boston has a city censor until, what year did Boston eliminate its city censor? 1982. Right, so Boston no longer is a place of ideas, the free exchange of ideas. Boston's a place of rejecting different people with different ideas. Highly anti-urban in terms of those things that make cities successful. Broadly speaking, tribalism, which is sort of the retreat to people that are like you. Obviously a big topic, but Protestant, Catholic conflict, particularly Irish Catholic versus Jewish conflict. Father Coughlin, who is a Detroit-based Catholic priest who has a very widely listened to radio show and a newspaper. Anyone know what his newspaper is called in the 1930s? One of the most ironic names for a newspaper like his, Social Justice. So highly anti-Semitic. His largest crowds by far are in Boston. Big following in Father Coughlin. Ends up unleashing great violence against the Jewish community in Boston. And then, of course, racism, conflict between the whites and the black community in Boston really holds the city back because we stop listening to other people and listening to different ideas. Then you get some major policies where local, state, and federal policies come together to now effectively destroy Boston. 1948, there's a plan drawn up for urban renewal. Anyone know what percentage of Boston is slated for demolition under the 1948 plan for Boston of urban renewal? I think it was 25%, but yeah, very, very high percent. Obviously not all of it goes through, but we lose the West End, we lose the New York streets, we lose Scully Square. Basically, urban renewal is replacing dense, diverse neighborhoods with low density, undiverse neighborhoods. Highway building displaces almost as many people as urban renewal, basically federal, state, and local policies to move people out of the city through highways. Of course, the communities where particularly blacks are not allowed to live through restrictive covenants and other barriers to ownership in those communities. So these whole series of policies in Boston are based on essentially tearing down those things that make cities vital in the 20th century and replacing it with highly anti-urban policies to move people out of cities. And so, sort of no surprise, Boston is unable to reinvent its economy while adopting these policies and practices. So, what does Boston get right in the 19th century? The answer is pretty much everything different from what we did in the 20th century. So, Boston in the 19th century becomes really the most innovative city in the world. Boston gets a nickname going back, I think, to the 1830s. Boston starts being called the Athens of America. So you have people with new ideas in every aspect of society and life. There is a revolution in thinking in all phases of society. So let's talk about some of them quickly, since we have a few minutes left. A reconception of religion. There's a lot of thinking that the reinvention of the economy in the 19th century would not have happened under Puritanism, but you have the rise of Unitarianism in Boston with William Ellery Channing, sort of a new conception of how people organize themselves religiously. Our relationship to nature, particularly with the Transcendental Movement. The first environmental movement in the country happens in New England, part of reaction to industry, but the first time people start writing and thinking about the environment. Education reform with people like Horace Mann. There's tremendous reform in the delivery of health care, in the treatment of people with disabilities, physical disabilities and mental disabilities. Prison reform. And then 1831, a man named William Lloyd Garrison starts a newspaper called The Liberator. And Garrison is a radical abolitionist. He was not the first person to write against slavery in the American South, but he's probably the first person to do so as forcefully as he does. But he does two things that are very interesting. So the real abolition movement finds its home in Boston, but Garrison does two things that are really, really interesting, I think. He hires as writers for The Liberator and lecturers, because giving lectures around New England, around the country, was a big part of the abolition movement. He hires African Americans and he hires women. And these writers and lecturers who are writing and lecturing to end slavery in the American South, the women who are part of his movement say, well, wait a second, what about women's rights in America? And the National Women's Rights Movement really comes out of Boston in the 1840s. And my book goes into that, but since we just have a few minutes, we won't go into that in great detail. But another thing happens related to this, which is the African-American writers and lecturers that he hires have the same reaction, which is, here we are fighting against slavery in the American South, but we do not have civil rights here in Boston at home. So quickly about race relations in Boston. In colonial North America, slavery is lawful in every colony, right? John Adams writes the Massachusetts Constitution. He writes that all men are born free and equal, okay? So a little bit different from what gets written later in the Constitution, but people are born free, John Adams writes. There is never, the General Court, which is the legislature of the Commonwealth, never passes a law outlawing slavery, but what happens is people start bringing court cases in the courts of the Commonwealth challenging the institution of slavery, and the courts of the Commonwealth say, well, if people are born free and equal, that's inconsistent with the concept of chattel slavery, and the courts stop enforcing the ownership in other human beings. So 1783, slavery ends in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. All the northern states quickly follow suit. So after 1783 and the decades that follow, slavery ends north of the Mason-Dixon line, continues in the American South. Slavery is then replaced in the North by lawful segregation in all aspects of society. So in all northern states and northern cities, it's a segregated society, all aspects of life. So if you think about Jim Crow laws in the American South, all of them applied in the North in the first half of the 19th century. So the African-American community of Boston, it was small, but they're writing about, as I said, the abolition movement, and they start saying, well, wait a second, we do not enjoy civil rights here at home. And they start the first civil rights movement in United States history. Their tools are all the ones that we associate with the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So what are some of the tools that we associate with the 20th century Civil Rights Movement? Boycotting, lawsuits, civil disobedience, petitioning, written advocacy are all brought to bear against segregation in Boston in the 1840s. 1843, the railroads are desegregated. 1843, the law against interracial marriage in Massachusetts is repealed by the General Court. 1847, Robert Morris becomes the first African-American member of the bar in Massachusetts, second in the country. And then the big one, 1851, the General Court desegregates the schools of Massachusetts. And if you look at pictures of school classes in Massachusetts and Boston in the second half of the 19th century, you see that Boston schools were integrated. And the resegregation of Boston schools leading up to school busing in the 1970s is not through just sort of the way things are, but through sort of these policies we talked about before that where the city resegregates. But when you reflect on this history, a city that is such a pioneer in civil rights, in women's rights, in social reform, is there sort of any question of why Boston was able to reform its economy in the 19th century, but not do so in the 20th century? In our last minute, I will now talk about the challenges of today. Kind of a big topic. I see several major ones. We are faced today with a housing crisis, with a transportation crisis, with a climate change crisis. By climate change, if you look at predicted flood maps for Boston in the, going out to 2050 or 2070, much of our infrastructure is at risk through rising sea level. We have an equity crisis again, and a real challenge through post-pandemic of people not returning to work and being in the city and supporting downtown. I think that the lesson for today is that we need to continue to remember what makes cities successful. We need to embrace the 3Ds, density, diversity, and good urban design. We can't be complacent. So going back to how I started this, for my clients who are thinking about investing in Boston, we cannot take for granted that Boston will remain a successful city. We have to be intentional about it and continue to make Boston successful through embracing policies that are good urban policies.